Horse evolution is something that was very interesting and has a interesting story. We know that the most, the oldest horse fossils, the most ancient, were very small animals. This is their skeleton. This is a complete skeleton here. They're about 0.4 meters in length, and their teeth were different. They had more. They had more space, less cement. They were had more ridges. They weren't less flat at the top. Um, their legs were shorter. They had more toes. They had 4 toes versus 1 toe. The 1 toe development occurred numerous times in the evolution of the horse. And so, what I mean by that is that you have to consider that there was a lot of genetic diversity in this lineage, that early on there was a lot of genetic and phenotypic diversity. So, when you looked at an environment where you had some grassland, some forest, you had all kinds of all kinds of different horses. They weren't horses at the time, they were various species of horse. So you had smaller ones that could easily get through the deep underbrush and thick trees of a forest. You had some that could eat leaves, and versus some that could only eat grass. And so the leaf eaters had a specific tooth shape that allowed them to cut the leaf up and then grind them. The grass eaters focused on grinding, so their teeth were slightly different. The ones that lived in the forest didn't need those long legs to allow them to take advantage of a lot of space. You have to remember that grass has very little nutrient in it, as far as it's very tough to get nutrition out of grass. So you have to eat a lot of it. So these grazers had to have a large area upon which to graze, and they had to do a lot of grazing in any particular day. So the longer their legs, the more land they could cover. Also, there's not a lot of places to hide from predators in a grassland, so you have to be able to run pretty quickly. So the longer legs gave them that ability to run through the grasslands to get food and to evade predators. So by developing this single digit, so you have to think of their hooves here. This part that sinks down is actually one finger. So this is their finger. So as horses evolved, they lost the other digits, and they focused on the one digit taking up the vast majority of this portion of their legs. The advantage to that is that their legs are longer, so they could do a better stride. They can cover more distance in a single step. The other advantage is that having only one digit to stand on versus 5, it's more stable. They have a lot more weight because they need all this muscle. So it allowed them to be more stable when they're standing or running. The face, the cheek area got bigger, allowed them to have more surface area to grind the grass, allowed them to have stronger muscles, larger muscles, to allow them to grind that grass up as they swallowed it. So there were a lot of different horse species living together at the same time in different niches because of adaptive radiation that occurred. Each horse species found its own little niche, and it coexisted. Unfortunately, the environment rarely stays the same for very long, or at least geologically speaking. So after some time, the forest started to die off, and they started to become giant grasslands. Now, this evolution happened here in the Americas. So horses actually started here in North America, which is kind of ironic because they became extinct about 11,000 years ago. And it was the Spanish conquistadores that reintroduced the horse. So the horse was thought to come from Europe, but actually it started in the Americas. They radiated adaptively. They did adaptive radiation, filled in niches all around the world. Some of them became zebras. Some of them became what we know of today as horses. But they spread out all over the world. And then the conquistadores, the Spanish conquistadors, when they brought the horses back over with them, they reintroduced the horse to an area where they had become extinct. So you take a look at the change in tooth structure. That happened because of the change in what they were eating, right? So by developing flatter teeth, they could focus on grinding grass versus ripping up leaves. The limb length, the longer lengths, allowed them to run through the grasslands easier. Now, mind you, remember what we're talking about here. They didn't change this one that had this one horse species that had this tooth did not become a horse species that had this tooth. This individual had a child that had a mutation that made it a little more flat, or maybe was completely flat. Its tooth looked closer to this one than it does to this one. And it coexisted, as you can see here, with its parents, with its great-grandparents. And it had an advantage. It could eat the grass and the leaves. And so its genes kept showing up in the population as it had sex and had babies. And the population, once the tree started to die away, those that had teeth that were more like this could survive longer, could survive the change in environment. Those that had teeth like this could not. They died off. And you were left with a population that had teeth like this. And that continued with each one of these different characteristics, including having one finger instead of having limbs that were made of one finger instead of four fingers. The one finger gave them an advantage. They had longer legs. They could run further. They could run away from predators. They could cover more area when search for food. So they had an advantage. But as you can see, there were many species existed about 8 million years ago, 5 million years ago. There were a lot of species that existed. But soon each of these species became extinct. And the only one left is not the only one. But the equus is the only species of, the only group, taxa of horse that's left. You have true horse and you have zebras, but the bottom line is that besides mules and donkeys and horses and zebras, the rest of these guys all went extinct. So these tiny horses, these larger horses, the ones with one digit, those that had 3 digits, it was a complicated group of or taxa of horses that lived together, and some were selected for and some were selected against. Some survived and others went extinct. And because of that change, you had a change in tooth structure. Because of the change in environment, you had a change in limb length, got longer. And a single toe, which is most of this leg here, that single toe allowed this horse to have the longer legs to allow them to be stable while standing and running and being so heavy. And the reason you have a really good example of the evolutionary process is because it's not one thing turning into another, turning into another, turning into another. The evolution of the horse is exactly the kind of non-directional. There's no one single particular direction, which is kind of one of the really big misconceptions of modern understanding of evolution, that we're somehow evolving to some perfect creature. That doesn't exist. There is no evolution towards some perfect creature. What it is that you have all these various genes with all these various options, small, large, sharp tooth, flat tooth, single digit, 2 digits, 3 digits, 4 digits on their in their legs, on their foot. And the environment changes, and those who were small died off. They could not survive. Those that did not have flat teeth to help them grind the grass could not get enough to eat, nutrition-wise, either died off or had less babies. And those that had flat teeth, had single toes, were single-toed, could run quickly, could cover a lot of distance, could get away from the predators. They survived, and they had a lot of babies, and today those are the ones we see roaming the Serengeti in Africa. Those are the ones we see in the west of America. Those are the ones we see in the world today. Are those descendants of the successful survivors from this group of organisms that used to live millions of years ago. These groups all lived together, but only this one survived. And that's the key to evolution, is that you have genetic diversity, you have phenotypic diversity. The environment changes unpredictably. We don't know whether there's going to be more. If there had been more forest instead of less forest, then this little horse may be the horses we see today, not the giant ones, because these guys would have a hard time surviving in this dense forest. But it didn't. What happened, what changed was the change was towards the grasslands. The forest started disappearing, so these horses were the ones that were able to survive, the ones that had flat teeth, long legs, a single digit, bone wider, longer snout, wider cheeks. These are the characteristics that allowed them to survive in a grassland versus living and growing up in a forest. And here's some of the bone changes and the different species and how they were either absent. Those characteristics are either absent, which would be a 0, or present. Right? So they were either absent or present, or they had 0 or 2 or 4, 3, 1, right? Number of complete digits. It's just a way scientists do is they create a table and they compare all the different characteristics of all the different species that existed to see if they were related and to see how they changed over time. You could take this data and then put it on a chart. It looks like this. We call this, an evolutionary tree, right? Here's another diagram of a similar tree. All right. So hopefully you get the idea of what evolution is. It's a group of organisms, each one having the more diversity, the better fit they are as a population to survive. Something happens, some are selected for, some are selected against. In the case of genetic drift, there's no selection really. It's just a random event that some survive, some don't. But in general, evolution tends to have, the only direction evolution is dependent on the change that's happening at that moment. There's no final direction. There's no perfect creature. It's what's right and what's perfect right now for this environment. Those are the ones that are selected for this environment. But the environment changes. So who will survive that environmental change? It all depends on how diverse that population is. A really good example, actually, not perfect, but there's a cheetah. The cheetah is evolved to take advantage of the grassland. It's very fast, the fastest land animal on Earth. And it's incredibly selected. It can only eat one certain food, can only live in one certain environment. If that environment changes, and it is changing, then that cheetah has no chance of survival. It can't adapt. Versus something like a dog that can survive numerous, it's a generalist. It can survive in so many different environments, and the dogs are incredibly genetically diverse. You can have small dogs, big dogs, they have long legs or short legs. They'll eat anything. Those dogs will more likely survive and radiate adaptively all around the world. Where something like a cheetah, as beautiful as it is, might be more evolved. Someone might say it's more evolved, but that's kind of a silly thing to say because nothing's more evolved than anything else. The direction of evolution of a cheetah led it to what is known as a dead end. It's not genetically, it cannot adapt any longer. Hopefully mutations and changes in the genetic code will increase genetic diversity, but as long as it stays genetically isolated, as long as they stay genetically isolated and they have no significant mutations, it's difficult to see how the cheetah could survive any major environmental change. All right, I hope this helped. Bye.